Good afternoon to all of you. I hope yes, I hope so. Yes. Firstly, let me warmly welcome all of you for another installment of our regular public lecture series organized by Center of Banking Studies of Central Bank of Sri Lanka. The objective of this public lecture series is to create awareness and trigger discussions on timely topics related to economy. So today's lecture will also be on another time-relevant topic, value chain financing for micro and small enterprises sector in Sri Lanka. And it will be delivered by Ms. Simrin Singh, Country Director of Sri Lanka and Maldives Office of International Labour Organization. Now, right now, this webinar is currently being telecasted via Zoom and Central Bank's official Facebook page, reaching a huge audience who have an interest on what we are about to discuss. Now, let me explain all of you the flow of today's webinar. Ms. Simrin's lecture will go for like 45 minutes or an hour or so. So then we'll be having a Q&A session where we hope to accommodate your questions regarding what was discussed in the lecture. So there are two ways that you can direct your questions to us. The first thing is you can direct your questions in the Q&A option in Zoom. So you can type your question in the Q&A column and can be posted there. Apart from that, if you're joining via Facebook, you can write your questions as a comment in the Facebook post. So we will try to accommodate as much as questions possible, given the interest of time. Now, with a great honor, I'd like to introduce the dignitaries of the expert panel today. We have Governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Deshamane Professor W. Lakshman, Deputy Governors of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Mr. K.M.M. Siriwardana and Mrs. T.M.J.Y.P. Fernando, and also our speaker today, Ms. Simrin Singh. Before we proceed to the webinar, I'd like to invite the Governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Deshamane Professor W. Lakshman, to deliver opening remarks for the lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Kushan. Let me begin by warmly welcoming all the participants, medium and small enterprise sector. Let me also welcome today's presenter of the webinar, Ms. Simrin Singh, the Country Director at ILO Country Office for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. I have been introduced as a panelist. I will remain with you as much as possible, but maybe I might not be available to make any comments at the end of the session as a panelist. I hope my absence will be filled up quite competently by the others who will be there, including the Deputy Governor, Mr. Siriwardana. Having spent over a year struggling with COVID-19, with bad times and pessimism, followed by good times and optimism, we have concluded the first quarter of 2021 with a strong sense of anticipation for the year 2021 to become our initial revival year of the post-pandemic or new normal period. We ended March 2021 with a prediction of an annual growth rate of 6% for 2021. The post-National New Year scenario at present, however, is making us less optimistic for the year. Through policy adjustments, we are constantly trying to achieve the optimistic targets. We strongly believe that to achieve a realistically high growth rate, Sri Lanka needs the contribution of MSME sector, which has been a major contributor to Sri Lanka's economy in terms of production and employment, and also contributing to equitable sharing of growth that is being achieved. And also contributed in terms of both income and regional distribution. The sector is also one of the most adversely pandemic affected sectors of the economy. The importance of MSMEs in the economy has been recognized in Sri Lanka all along, but in early stages of MSME policies, the focus was to help individual MSMEs to produce more and at lower cost. Many such programs of MSME assistance, I can remember, in early stages came under criticism that they ended up in getting more produce with no concern about how to dispose of the incremental product. The present day MSME assistance program are more encouraging and clearly more promising with greater concern about value chains and markets, including export markets. The greater focus also on introduction of modern technology in these MSME promotional programs today is also encouraged. To incorporate value chain development in MSME promotional programs require to focus on several aspects. Of these, value chain financing is one important aspect. MSC promotion together with relevant value chains would ensure that MSME producers are not exploited by the middlemen, leading to indebtedness and frustration of the producers. The recovery of MSME sector has not come up to expected levels yet. Today's webinar, I believe, would provide useful insights into value chain financing for MSME sector in Sri Lanka, thus helping us to improve our MSME sector policies with positive results on production, employment, export, and regional growth impacts of the sector. Thank you very much, and let me hope to be able to listen to a useful presentation, valuable presentation from Ms. Simrin Singh. I invite Kushan to begin the program with an introduction of Ms. Singh to you. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, sir, for delivering opening remarks. So the tone is set and everything's ready, so we are good to go ahead. Before that, let me introduce today's speaker to all of you. Ms. Simrin Singh, who is a national of United States of America, has been a staff member of International Labour Organization, ILO, since the year 2000. Since then, she has held various positions in different ILO offices, as well as at ILO headquarters in Geneva. A previous post at the ILO held between 2008 and 2017 was a senior specialist on fundamental principles and rights at work based in the regional office for Asia and Pacific at Bangkok, Thailand. Ms. Singh holds a bachelor's degree in anthropology and sociology from Connecticut College in the USA and a master's degree in international development studies from the George Washington University in USA. So that is Ms. Simran. So without further ado, let me now invite Ms. Simrin Singh to commence our lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Simrin Singh. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Rashid, and also for the words by the governor of the central bank, Professor Lakshman. Thank you also for emphasizing how important MSCs are, micro small enterprises, also for the growth of the country. And I'm very pleased that the central bank, including through this outfit, has reached out to the ILO to be able to share our views and our experiences on this model that could be one such model that would help bring back and build back better, not just the areas in which you wanted to see MSC growth and contribution to the economy prior to COVID, but certainly also in a COVID world and going forward. So I'm going to start with my presentation at this point, and I will share the screen. I hope it's clear.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. So as you can see, this is the topic of the day, and I'm going to share particularly experiences that the ILO has had since COVID came around, because this is where we did experiment and pilot this value chain financing model for Sri Lanka, which showed quite a lot of promising results that could be replicated. So this is an outline of my lecture, which is basically on the significance and challenges of the micro small enterprises in Sri Lanka, the impact of COVID that's had on it, and what then value chain financing actually is with regard to micro small enterprises. What are the different types of value chain financing and how they work, and how we in the ILO actually adopted this as part of our programming approach in a COVID response, and what have been some of the key learnings and some opportunities. So here we go, a little bit on the MSC sector, although Professor Laxman already gave some inputs. Basically, it's a very, very significant part of the Sri Lankan economy, with 98.7% micro and small enterprises among all establishments. So basically, most establishments that are here in Sri Lanka are pretty much defined and categorized as micro and small enterprise. And I just want to pause here just to make sure we're on the same page in terms of what and how micro small enterprises are defined. A small enterprise, according to the local definition, is any enterprise with less than 50 employees. And a micro enterprise is any establishment where there are less than 15 employees. So anything under 50, and by and large, as you can see, most establishments fall under the small or micro categories here in Sri Lanka, 98.7%. Only 57% of those are registered. So most of them, in other words, are operating in the informal economy. And 62% of employment of total workforce is in these MSCs is focusing on industry, trade, and services. Only 25% of the micro small enterprises are run by women. So this is also an area one needs to focus on going forward. Now, what are the challenges pre-COVID and certainly during COVID? But let me just start. What were already existing challenges when it came to micro small enterprises, especially here in Sri Lanka, but maybe also very much so in other parts of the world? First and foremost, and this is why we're talking about this, is access to finance. They have a lot of issues in terms of poor record keeping. They can't, the documentation of their financing. They have usually a fairly poor credit history or rating. So formal bank channels don't always find them attractive to be able to give loans to, etc. Because of this poor credit rating or history. They also are not just intimidated, but they just don't know how necessarily to approach and what kind of a conversation to have or the questions to even ask if they do go to channels in terms of the formal banking financial sector. And then you have, on the other hand, also generally speaking, often poorly suited financial products for them. So even if they go, the kind of nature of business, remember, under 15 employees or even under 50, often the packages for SME or enterprise support offered by financial institutions tend to be geared towards perhaps larger institutions or larger establishments. Then on the other hand, not only is there this challenge of finance access, but there's also a serious access issue with it, access to markets. Here you find that a lot of the micro small enterprises don't differentiate products. So in other words, many of them are making the same thing. in one locality. The products are very much the same, and so they overflood the market in terms of that product, and therefore the prices are down, and then they also don't have the right channels with which to be able to diversify and also access those markets. So this whole issue of market diversification is an issue. And I've seen this firsthand, actually. We've done some bank clinics, so to speak, in Gampaha and Kalutara in the COVID response. And many of these micro small enterprises that came looking for financial access loans came with their products. And these products, pretty much everyone was doing some form of tailoring, or pretty much everyone was doing some form of pottery. And that's too congested in one particular area, and there's a need for diversification. You don't see that. Certainly, you also have issues related to access to technology. And we know technology has been very instrumental, and it's growing. It is here with us to stay and into the future. But traditionally and typically, micro small enterprises have poor knowledge or information about what is available through technology, and how to use it to be able to access markets, to be able to access financing, or even to improve their own products and the kind of services that they would offer as part of an MSE. So really, there's also this inability as a result for them not to be able to harness that technological, what's available out there in the world to gain greater productivity, efficiencies, etc. And then finally, another aspect is that they lack access to business BDS, business development services. And this is in terms of, services so that they can bring their product or services up to the kind of standards, can get the kind of certifications that make them that much more competitive, attractive to the markets and consumers. There's definitely very limited investment, unlike you find in large enterprises and establishments. There's very little in terms of assistance in product development, research and development, in terms of diversification. And then finally, you also have this issue of skills. They tend to maintain the same level of skills in terms of the products and services offered, as opposed to it becoming a learning and a constant skilling approach. This is a typically the nature of enterprises. Now, moving on, if you look at COVID, the first thing that happened and came to our light, and this was also with the Labor Department of Labor, Ministry of Labor, they did an establishment survey, and they said, what is the prime issue facing the establishments in the country? And many of the establishments that responded to those surveys were those that fell under this micro small enterprise label. And it was by and large the issue of working capital. So this is where the ILO sort of came in and started to think, how can we see how we can help facilitate access to this very much needed working capital? The reason why there was such a deficit, maybe it's a no-brainer to everyone, but let me just go over it. You saw a trend in terms of decrease in sales. There was a decrease in demand because there was less spending power. And then there was distribution because of lockdowns and what have you. There were distribution and delivery challenges also for a prolonged period. You found MSCs found it difficult to meet their operating expenses. Most of them, or many of them, were already in debt prior to COVID, and basically you found a situation where they were in higher debt as a result, because they had to go through other means to be able to access this working capital, throwing them deeper into indebtedness. And basically the payments that they were supposed to receive were stuck. So they didn't get receipt of payments for products that had already been delivered. And this affected large enterprises as well, including many in the garment sector, as we know. So you have that. And then in terms of jobs, they had reduced workers, staff, rosters were introduced to avoid redundant staff. People had to be released. Many would leave without pay. Reemployment was not necessarily possible. So you really had also not the workforce being able to physically work and provide services needed for these establishments, these enterprises. And then in terms of raw materials, it was hard to get. I remember meeting with some micro small enterprises led by a woman in Panadura district, and her issue was not so much the things that she could actually, she was a spice maker, not making the spices, but the issue was getting the bottles or the packaging to be able to distribute it. So different aspects were also difficult for them to access, and then these inputs into the supply chain. And we found the prices escalating as a result because there weren't enough of these supplies going around. Logistics, but at the same time, not everything was gloom and doom. Things did actually start to look up. There were some opportunities that started to emerge in this COVID thing. Certainly we know health and hygiene related products, enterprises that were producing those probably and did do very well because the demand, a huge surge in demands. Certain enterprises repurposed themselves to be able to provide sanitizers, etc. And we know that they did quite all right as well. But it also really opened up the doorways to e-commerce as an opportunity to be able to provide market access, but also to help in terms of pricing of products and being able to put there and see the diversity and the needs of the kind of demand side of things of the kind of products that enterprises could potentially diversify to be able to use e-commerce as a way of better market access, etc. So now on to what is value chain finance. Let me start by saying that I'm not a value chain finance expert, but I do have a fantastic set of colleagues within the ILO that have been working on this, and we've been working very closely together. So I want to thank them at the outset for working with me so that I can share this model with you, which I think is very important. So here's what is defined as a value chain. A value chain describes the full range of activities that are required to bring a product or service from conception through the intermediary phases of production and delivery to final consumers and final disposal after use. So pretty much from, absolute initiation from what's supplied to what is delivered, what is consumed, and then it's disposed of. So the value chain really spans a pretty large spectrum from start to finish of a product or service. Hang with me on this, this slide. So it's trying to capture how MSCs basically interact with other parts and especially with the kind of services here, because we're talking about financial services as well and the whole financing side of value chain. So you see, when I'm talking about this whole spectrum, the value chain begins at where the input, the actual original input is supplied. So for instance, if you're making peanut butter or something, your input supply would be the actual peanuts starting. And then you have the actual production side of what happens and how do you sort it and everything. And then you have the processing side. So that's where you have the machinery or people that basically grind the peanuts or whatever the product is to make that actual peanut butter. And then you basically then decide whether that product then goes for wholesale here in Sri Lanka or for the domestic market, or whether it is certified and meets the standards and can actually go for export for global markets. So that's the whole variety of the chain, the value chain that I'm describing. And all throughout each one, there's financial transactions taking place. So you will find micro small enterprises at the input supply level, all the way up to also the wholesale domestic market, as well as the global market levels throughout this chain. And there, across of this, on the left side, if you look, there's a number of supporting functions that need to be taking place for these micro small enterprises. And this is where financial service providers are extremely essential. And you saw the need for them, particularly during COVID, in terms of this working capital issue, because all these levels of the value chain were affected and disrupted and had serious working capital issues, including global markets, as we know, export markets that weren't able to procure many of the goods, products and services. So what is then value chain finance? Here, as I said, all of those levels cut across have financing aspects, and one of the key support services are these financial services. So this is where the finance of value chain comes in, and it refers to financial products or services that flow to or through any point in a value chain in order to increase returns on investment, growth and competitiveness of that value chain. Very important. So they come in at every level to increase returns on investment, growth of the enterprise and product, and increasing its competitiveness along the entire value chain. The value chain financing pivots around the transactional relationship between those that are buying and those that are selling. And it's very important to note that it is built on mutual understanding of mutual trust and of benefit, mutual benefit and trust. So it's a bit of a different kind of model than the usual placing an order and just getting it. It actually is a symbiotic one where a relationship of trust must be established, as well as a common understanding that there's a mutual benefit to be gained when it comes to this kind of relationship in terms of investment, in terms of growth, in terms of competitiveness. So it's a win-win for both parties, the buyers and the sellers. So there's two kinds of value chain financing. There's the direct value chain financing and there's indirect value chain financing. Let me start on the left side, which is on direct value chain financing, which is between a buyer and seller, where the issue is that the buyer wants to be sure that he or she has access to a flow of the same quality and volume or of a product that they need, and they need it, and they need it on time. So they're really committed that they want that product, and the seller is also happy because the buyer is there and is there to definitely buy that product. So they know that they have a buyer that wants to buy, and a buyer knows that they have a seller that wants to sell. There's a commitment to supply the products and to produce the products for that buyer. And in that sense, what happens here is that because the buyer wants to make sure that he or she does get the products from the seller in time, of quality and of the volume needed, that buyer pre-finances the production of whatever inputs the seller would sell. So they, as a company, and a larger establishment, for example, and we have, this is what we have tried, that I'll talk about a little bit later, where the buyer actually does pre-finance to some degree what is needed so that the seller can do it. So there's no necessarily bank relationship as obvious here related to this kind of value chain financing. But there's another form of value chain financing which is considered indirect, and this is where banks can play a crucial role, or financial institutions that are more formal financial institutions, where you still have that same transaction between the buyer and seller. The buyer needs the products, the seller wants to sell the products. They're assured of the continuity of the supply, but the buyer doesn't have the working capital or the ability, sorry, the seller does not have the working capital. So this is now the micro small enterprises. They don't have the capital necessarily to be able to produce because they don't have the money to do so. So basically what then happens is that the buyer makes an arrangement with the financial institution that then pre-finances against the seller. And this is a very, very good thing, because if there's an invoice on an invoice basis, basically. So if this helps, because if there's no flow at this point, it still staggers it, but it's based on the reputation and good credit history and ratings of a larger establishment, more formal sector establishment. So the risk to the banks is considerably lower. And this type of financial institution then can basically do this reverse kind of financial invoicing and supply chain, value chain financing for that same product. So these are the two models, one that's done directly through the companies or this larger establishments, the buyers basically, and then the second one that is done through pre-financing or other invoicing kind of mechanisms that is channeled through a banking institution. And this type of model hasn't actually been explored to the extent that it could be explored here in Sri Lanka is our observation. And we think there's great opportunity for the banking and financial sector to consider using this type of value chain financing to also see the competitiveness, growth, et cetera, of MSCs going forward. So here's what ILO did pretty much a year ago as COVID began, actually started in about June last year. We have a program that's really about seeing how people could return to work, how we knew that the micro small enterprise sector had been hardest hit here in Sri Lanka across the board. We knew certain districts in particular, Gampaha Kalutara, I keep saying, and we're seeing it again now with wave 3. Yeah, very, very hard hit, and there are huge concentrations of MSCs in those areas. So the idea was, how could we on one hand look at what kind of safety and health measures can be put in place for them to return to work when they work or to continue working, so that the workplace is not where COVID is spread. So there was a safety and health component, but complementing that really was on how we could help facilitate an enhanced access to finance and business management skills to resume and continue operations. And there were 3 core intervention areas in this model. One was access to finance and the kind of initial government central bank stimulus packages targeting various sectors at tourism or whatever else, but also targeting these small enterprises for a period of time. So access to these packages, and I think colleagues in the central bank know how much we've talked with you as well as other financial sector banks on how we can facilitate access to MSCs to some of these financial products and services offered for MSCs in a COVID world. So that was one intervention. The second one, which I'm going to talk a bit more, which is the topic today, which is on developing a credit support system for small enterprises through this value chain financing model. And then the third complementing one was also really trying to understand and respond to the multidimensional vulnerabilities, particularly of female-owned micro small enterprises, because there were certainly we were observing a number of other multidimensional vulnerabilities, particularly affecting women-owned and operated micro small enterprises. So here's the rundown of what we did in this value chain financing model under this healthy socioeconomic recovery model. Here, if you look at the left-hand side, we identified some lead firms, basically lead firms in Sri Lanka that are processors as well as exporters, actually, to tap into the export market, who then provided a working capital loan to small scale or primary micro small enterprises, processors, which in its form basically allowed for in-time delivery for these lead firms, so they were still able to get this product. And this was done as giving this working capital loan was done against an adjustment with an invoice given. And all throughout, I mean, this timely delivery, this ability to adjust, make adjustments through sort of an invoicing kind of system with the working capital loan also actually guaranteed also a repeat in orders. So it kept the engine functioning very well in the interest of both the microprocessors, so basically the sellers, with the buyers, which were these big processors and exporters that were these lead firms. One added incentive was the fact that because of these additional safety measures, occupational safety and health measures put in place, it was that much more attractive for both the lead firms as well as the small scale processors, ensured that the kind of measures or optimal measures were being taken to ensure that the products that were being delivered and transported and et cetera produced were not being produced in COVID prone or unhealthy workplaces. So the ILO offer was basically to create and have this model adopted, that the working capital loan would be released, and equal amount of support that we would provide to both suppliers with these safety measures, as well as in terms of productive equipment and facilities. So how can they also increase their productivity where they are working and producing these primary processed products in these establishments. So in terms of outreach, I mean, maybe the small to you or big to you, but we think it's quite big because of its potential for learning and replicability. But there was 4 large exporters and as much as 120,000 US dollars worth in Lankan rupees was disbursed by those companies. So it was not even the financial institutions, it was actually those companies, these 4 large exporting companies that actually dispersed this to small enterprises. And so from there, they covered something like 93 micro small enterprises, of which more than 30% were female owned, and over 1,000 or about 1,000 workers in those micro small enterprises were able to continue in their jobs and in a much more improved, safe and productive working environment. So it was a win-win for all. And it was an investment made by the companies, but they were guaranteed the products that they needed I'm going to show a video.
Mama කලින් හිටියේ ෆෝසස් සිටියේ ගොවිතැන් කෙරුවා එක දේවල් කෙරුවා කොහු ව්‍යාපාරයට මේක පටන් ගත්තා
ෆැමිලි එකෙත් කරන්නේ මේ කොහු බතාශ්‍රිත නිෂ්පාදන ඉස්සෙල්ලාම කළේ පෝල්ට්‍රි ෆාම්ස් බට් ඒක හරියට අපිට ඩෙවලොප් කරගන්න බැරි වුණා අවුරුද්දක් තමයි මේක පටන් අරගෙන
මම ඉස්සෙල්ලා වැඩ කරුවේ මේ ලොරි එක ඩ්‍රයිවිං වැඩ කරුවේ ඒක කරලා ඊට පස්සේ කොහොමත් අදින ගමන් තමයි මේ ගල් ඉතුරු කරාගෙන මැෂින් එක දාන්න අඩිතාලම සාමාන්‍ය සතියේ දවස් 2-3 වැඩ කරනවා වගේ තිබ්බා
අපට වැඩ කරන්න ගෙදරකට කට්ටිය ගෙන්න ගන්න තරම් බැරි විදියට එහෙම තිබුණා නමුත් ඒගොල්ලන්ට මම අර සාමාන්‍ය මට දෙන්න පුළුවන් වියදමක් සතියට මම ඒත් ඒගොල්ලන්ට දුන්නා
අපි දුරින් ගෙන ආපු ඒව එකක්වත් අපිට ගන්න හම්බුනේ නැහැ මේ කියන්නේ දවස් ඇතුළත ලෝඩ්ස් 3-4ක්වත් මෙතනට ගෙනා ගන්න පුළුවන් වෙන්න 750 හරි එකකට වැඩි කරලා හරි මේ ළඟින් අපිට ඇද ගන්න සිද්ධ වුණා.
ඒක දිගටම කරගෙන යන්න පුළුවන්කමක් තිබුණ නැති නිසා අපට අර එන ආදායම සතියේ ආදායම මේක ඒ සතියෙන් ඉවර වෙනවා එතකොට.
අපි සතිය අපි චක්‍රයක් වගේ ඇඳලා මෙයාගේ මෙහෙම පොඩ්ඩක් ගන්නවා ඊට පස්සේ එයාගේ මුදල් මෙතනට බේරනවා.
ලෝන් දෙනවා එතකොට ඒව අපිට පහසු ක්‍රමයට අපි කිව්වා මේගොල්ලෝ අඩු කර ගන්නවා ආයතන අඩු කරන ගන්නවා
වගේ මට ලොකු මේ ප්‍රාග්ධන කැපිටල් මට එහෙම තිබුණේ නැහැ ඉතින් එතකොට අපිට අර ලෙලි වුණත් අතේ සල්ලි වලට මේවා කරන්න ලෙලි ප්‍රශ්න තමයි ගොඩක් ඉතින් ඒ හින්දා අර ඒ ලැබුණු එකෙන් අපිට ලෙලි කියන ප්‍රශ්නේදී ලොකු උත්තරයක් වුණා
මට මේ ෆ්ලෝ එක තමයි ලොකු කර ගන්න ඕනේ
ෆ්ලෝ එක දාගන්න තමයි බලාපොරොත්තු ඉන්නේ අර අපිට පහසු එහෙම තිබ්බොත් පෙමිතියත් හොඳයි يعني වැලි කලවම් වෙන්නේ නැහැ රොඩු එහෙම කලවම් වෙන්නෙත් නැහැ ඉතින් අර ඔක්කොම පහසු දවස් දෙකෙන් වේල ගන්න තියෙන එක දවසෙන් වගේ වේල ගන්නත් පුළුවන් අවුවත් ඒක
මගේ රූෆ් එක මේ ගිය සතියේත් කඩාගෙන වැටුණා ඒක පිළිසකර කරන්න තමයි මේ මුලින්ම බලාපොරොත්තුව තියෙන්නේ
ව්‍යාපාරී ඉස්සෙල්ලාම ටිකක් ලස්සනට කියන්නේ වැඩි දියුණු කරගන්න එක තමයි බලාපොරොත්තු තියෙන්නේ.
බලාපොරොත්තුවක් තියෙනවා අපි කියන්නේ ඊළඟ නිෂ්පාදනයකට යන්න. කියන්නේ දැන් මේක ප්‍රාථමික නිෂ්පාදනයක් නිසාවෙන් අපි ද්විතීයික නිෂ්පාදනයකට යන්න බලාපොරොත්තුවක් තියෙනවා.
Yes, Ms. Simrin, you can share your screen again.
Okay, I'm about to do that. Thank you. I'm glad it worked. Okay. So here we are. You saw how this worked, and in this particular instance, you saw what worked in terms of the coir industry. And as you know, that's actually in high demand also in external markets, not only domestically. So this was a very good thing. The ILO came in to provide some financial cost sharing or whatever support, but we also, I think going forward in the future, this could be also a role in terms of the co-financing that could be something that the banking and the financial sector could look at. So it's not just an ILO project that does this. Are you able to see my slide? Okay.
Yes, we can, Ms. Simrin.
Okay. So let's talk a bit about some of the challenges, experiences, and learning from this model. One key learning was how do you even select which value chain to pick? And we were struggling. We said, do we do it in terms of, do we go for the spice value chain? Do we look at mushrooms? I mean, what are the actual products that are in demand, right? Both in terms of the domestic market, but also potentially in terms of the export market. So which value chain to select? And then you have to also make sure that there's actually a presence and interest of lead firms to collaborate, either through this direct or this indirect value chain financing model. So you might have a great product with a potential, but you don't have a lead enterprise or firm there that wishes to enter into this trusting kind of mutually beneficial relationship with the suppliers. And then there's also this issue that sometimes lead firms say, okay, this is just the way we've operated. We have our suppliers, this is how we deal with it. So there's a sometimes resistance to being adaptable, and value chain financing does require some degree of adaptation that should be taken by different lead firms. So these are kind of adaptations. Let me just explain this a little bit more. You know, instead of their regular practice of cash checks to suppliers, are they adaptable, and will they do that through bank transfer instead? You know, will they be also looking at perhaps making sure that their suppliers, those micro small enterprises supplying them with the products or services, that they open new bank accounts? So this is something that is something a lead firm would need to do in this model. And then in terms of developing and implementing a formal working capital loan agreements between them and suppliers. So then you don't always have lawyers come in, but there were challenges in terms of this kind of deal, this working capital agreement, so to speak, that was given to micro small enterprises between the suppliers and the buyers. And that was, you know, you need lead firms to have that kind of adaptability to develop such a agreement. And then finally, the issue of recruitment of contractors and monitoring of machinery, workplace improvement at the supplier's premises. So they have to be more hands-on in this model. You just don't place an order over the phone and expect everything to work out. There is some degree of the kind of your staff also overseeing and actually looking at monitoring the kind of workplace improvements, productivity improvements based on the inputs you've given it, whether it's the machinery that you financed or this other working capital loan. And I can tell you that, you know, certainly my colleagues have gone on multiple visits to some of these micro, small enterprises together with key persons in the lead firm to really observe and see how they are symbiotically working and supporting each other. And this is a very important aspect. There has to be this relationship and this adaptability of lead firms. And then we had some experiences also in terms of accommodating micro small enterprises within the value chain financing, because this very issue I raised already at the beginning, we all know they have a very poor credit history. Their crib records aren't always great, and they're quite financially vulnerable. So are they worth that investment, especially if you're looking at it from a bank perspective? And then the practice of cash transaction restricts prospects of becoming bankable. So everything is done in cash. They don't have a bank account necessarily. They're not using any formal channels. And without these accounts, then they could, maybe because they were a loan defaulter or whatever it might be in a certain bank. And so they really then started to actually exhibit, we realized very much a very, very narrow understanding about the range of financial services that are available to them. So this is something that was a key learning. And it's something that hasn't been fully overcome, but I think there's a common understanding we've reached also certainly with banks that are implementing central bank schemes, et cetera, about how important the range of financial services are and how to promote an understanding of these financial services. So one of the things that we've been supporting and that I believe will be actually going nationwide and very, very pleased about this is the fact that these facilitated clinics of banks actually going out to different divisional levels and explaining the kind of range of services and products coupled with some degree of business development services as well. It is showing a lot, this kind of facilitating arrangement shows a lot of potential and can also very much be used as a platform for indirect value chain financing models to be promoted. So our learning also experiences from lead firms, what has been some of the takeaways from the lead firms. This is the Tropicore, we had 4 lead firms in this particular case. They all agreed that this financing model is really improves the relationship between the buyer and seller because of this issue. They see mutual interest. And there was, even though there was this trust and everything, there was this introduction of some sort of formality and documentation was very important. And they initially took some time because many of these micro small enterprises didn't have the skills on how to document what they're doing. So they're getting these working capital loans and they just simply couldn't keep their record books intact and show what they were delivering. So the bookkeeping, for lack of a better word, was perhaps the biggest challenge. And those skills really needed to be invested in. And so these lead firms did actually do that. And I think that was very important. What we also felt is a learning from this is that this direct value chain financing through the lead firm, the buyer and seller, can be adapted in any industry where buyers are willing to pre-finance their suppliers to ensure supplies in time. So that's a fundamental. They want their supplies in time and they're willing to pre-finance. But in terms of replication scale up, this indirect value chain financing through financial institutions here as another party in this, this relationship between buyers and sellers, it's much more suitable where buyers need credit period to pay their dues to suppliers. So it buys them some time, which is very important also. But it's based on their reputation. So they're able to then also access that finance and make sure that the supplies remain steady because the suppliers are getting paid. They're getting the working capital they need to produce what's needed in terms of supplies. And then it's invoiced against something that the lead firm can then pay back to the bank. Get it? So the bank actually is the one that has the money at hand. but does it on this relationship or agreement with the lead firm that they will pay against invoices. And to promote this indirect value chain financing, more and more financial institutions need to come forward and try to promote this amongst large firms. We really believe this has great potential and that has not been tapped yet in Sri Lanka. There's a few of these models, yes, where the lead supplier with the buyers have this relationship. The ILO has actually been engaged in facilitating this for several years in other parts of the country as well. But I think when we have a problem of the scale in terms of the impact of COVID, and particularly on micro and small enterprises that are, as I said in the very beginning, 98.7% or something of establishments in the entire country that are hurting very bad and will no doubt be hurting extremely after this third wave as well, this protracted crisis. I think it is time for financial institutions to also look, working with other lead firms to see how they can actually also offer, instead of direct loans just to micro small enterprises, perhaps look at this value chain, indirect value chain financing model to also make it a mechanism through which the value chains keep functioning and working capital is available and products are met and of high quality, are competitive, and also perhaps, I mean, certainly ready for domestic markets, but also for export markets. That's it for me. Thank you for listening. And this, you can see a number of work that ILO's been doing. You can see our social media handles, contact details as well. But I just wanted to draw your attention to a number of things that we've done in terms of, on the right side, you see the business continuity planning as an area of work, which is very relevant now in the COVID environment and related to also financial sector. We've done a great analysis of also what the future of work looks like for Sri Lanka and where there is potential for growth and for economic growth as well as decent work, and how technology basically is playing a role. I touched on many of these aspects at the beginning of my presentation, where it was access to markets, access to finance, access to technology, all of those things interplay, and there was already analysis when it comes to the future of work that we did on this in terms of platformization and the kind of green growth-led enterprise development that one could be looking at that would set Sri Lanka apart, as well as also, as we know, the tea sector kind of remains stable as well over the COVID crisis, but also what future work might look like for a very large smallholder tea sector. One of the things we have observed there is that many of these smallholder tea sector farmers, if you will, actually are also micro small entrepreneurs, enterprise holders. They have multiple occupations. So in your spare time, have a read, visit our website, and I look forward to continuing to, myself and my team look forward to continuing our engagement with you on any of these aspects. Thank you, and over to you, Kushan.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Simrin. So we have a clear idea what value chain financing is and how it can be applicable to drive the economy in Sri Lanka. So now we have a few minutes left for the Q&A session. So if you have any questions, the audience can put those questions forward in the Q&A column in Zoom, and as we said earlier in Facebook. So Ms. Simrin, let me forward one question for you. Now, you said now, if you have to operationalize this arrangement, let's say a value chain financing model for other industries as well, we may need to have a strong institutional arrangement, as well as we might need to have some policy changes also. So what kind of framework you suggest if we are to implement this in the national level?
Okay, perhaps you can send a few questions and I will try to take them while I have a time to reflect on each one. If there's another question at this point, if you don't mind, also raising that, especially if it's similar.
Yes. We have another question now, especially with regard to now this pilot project. It has been done with regard to coconut and coir industry. So now tourism is one of the hardest hit sectors with this pandemic, and there are a few questions thrown at the table asking that how this model can be applicable to services industry, specifically, let's say to tourism. So what is your idea on that?
Perhaps I'll start with tourism and then return to the big one. I think certainly one of the observations we had in terms of the hardest hit micro small enterprises, a lot of them were in what would be categorized as food and accommodation services, right? And by and large, food and accommodation services are part of the tourism ecosystem. One thinks of tourism and one thinks only of the large hotels and international tourism, but there was a fairly sizable domestic tourism market, but also a lot of the tourism ecosystem, which was fueled by these micro small enterprises, whether they were tourism operating service, transport, transport operators and providers, or certain kinds of processed products, agricultural product providers, etc. So I see a lot of potential there in terms of also bringing in some of the lead firms so that this symbiotic relationship between, there's no isolation saying, okay, my hotel is going to operate on its own, but there's a recognition that that hotel, for it to operate successfully and competitively, also there's a need for them to look at value chain financing of those that are providing transport, those that are providing food services, perhaps also for those that have accommodation services that are for a slightly lower or different kind of market, because by creating an ecosystem around one geographical area, say that's attractive for tourism, would mean that there's a lot of other available choices, and also the kind of small enterprise to niche restaurants or food producers, etc. So I see a very important role here for some of the bigger players in the tourism sector to also look at the health of the ecosystem of MSCs that are part and parcel of the tourism ecosystem there, and to look at how some of the financing can be done there. The good news I've observed is that many of those larger lead firms in the tourism sector actually are diversified themselves. So even though the tourism sector has been hit, and it's been largely the people employed very much so in the tourism sector, many of those firms have actually, the lead firms, or as you would call them, have done fairly well because they have diversified portfolios. They didn't put all their eggs in the tourism and hotels basket, but they're also producing food products, and some of them even saw growth during the COVID period. So I think there's huge untapped potential, and it's important for us to look at seeing how they could also start being part of the solutions to this thing. Now, on the first question you had about what kind of a policy environment or what can we do to actually scale up, I think, this has been a pilot. It seems to show a lot of promise, but I would obviously not say this should just be expanded and replicated right away nationwide, because different value chains have different characteristics, whether you're coming from whether it's a product or whether it's a service, and the nature of the kind of product, whether it's a food product or if it's a artisanal product, handicraft, etc. Each value chain has its own particular characteristics. But what can actually be done more broadly for starters or to help facilitate an environment is that I think an entity like the central bank perhaps could look at developing some sort of guidelines for commercial banks to develop value chain financing, the indirect value chain financing model. It's this indirect value chain financing model. They don't have such things right now. None of the banks, as far as we are aware, I might be wrong, are actually doing this model here in Sri Lanka. So this is great potential. And so, of course, ILO would be very happy to work with the central bank, but if something is issued at the macro level from the central bank, in terms of guidelines for commercial banks that are dealing with firms, larger establishments, as well as the smaller establishments on indirect value chain financing, that would really be help. And perhaps to get started, have it initiated, piloted with a few banks. You need to build further also with this experience. I don't wait for it to be the perfect model and then roll it out. There's going to be a lot of learning as you go still with this, and because each value chain has its own unique characteristics, and a lot of analysis needs to also be given as to where the marketability of all of this is, whether it's a domestic market, whether the export markets. So this is something that we have to do carefully, but I think we should, and under the guidelines issued from the central bank, we can get very far, but start with some interested commercial banks. We did start initial conversations as ILO with a few of them, but under the context of this program of work currently that I've described as a COVID response, we weren't able to advance it to the level we would have liked to. But as I said, we would like to work together with these potentially interested commercial banks and the central banks. We can, maybe start with a few key sectors. You already mentioned tourism, and so that's definitely of interest. We know how hard it is, and certainly the ILO has been approached through whether it's the Ministry of Labor or the Tourism Development Authority, a number of other outlets to let's find solutions for the hardest hit tourism. So we'd be happy if there's interest with the banks also to try to develop value chain financing, indirect value chain financing models for tourism sector. But we also know that the garment sector has been, the ready-made garment sector, apparel sector has been also hit hard. So that's also a potential value chain that we'd be happy to work with in terms of value chain financing, indirect value chain financing models. So maybe start with a few and see how it could be expanded. This model might not be suitable for every single value chain, but certainly we know the hard hit ones. I think it's important we certainly give it a try, because many workers are suffering, and many of these enterprises are suffering, and they've been suffering over the long haul. Over to you, Patrick.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Simrin, for that detailed and comprehensive answer. One more question, if I'm to shoot there. Now, you mentioned that that mutual trust is essential in operationalizing value chain financing. So in that case, standardizing and improving transparency in trade practices will play a very important role. So any suggestions you can think of to improve these trade practices and improve transparency? How we can encourage all these buyers and sellers to be more transparent and improve their trade practices?
You're absolutely right. I mean, trust, right, is so important. And then for that, the other T, which is transparency, is extremely crucial. I think at the beginning of the presentation, I spoke a bit about the potential opportunity that e-commerce has brought and these kinds of platforms. I think digitizing some of the side of things, the digital side of things, in terms of determining what are the kind of products that are available by geographical area, what the demand is for them, where it can be supplied, where the potential access to markets are. All of those other parts of, it being beyond just, hey, I'll give you money and you grow the product and I'll buy it. That whole infrastructure, in a way, when it comes to commerce, from others in the agricultural field, for example, call it, is it from farm to fork? Basically along that value chain, I think need to have access to similar information, and this needs to be as real time as possible, as well as facilitated. So I think there's great potential. I think you're already in Sri Lanka working towards, there's a number of different e-commerce platforms as well that are out there and at different levels for different kinds of products and services. So I think there's some degree of maybe standardization that needs to be made, and looking at it from the lens of MSCs. I think also another way of creating greater transparency is more formalization of the transactions. For example, these, whether it's the purchase order, whether it's the contract, whether it's a transaction with the bank. And that's, again, where I think, we feel that this value chain, indirect financing, when you have a financial institution also engaged, can be even better, because that forces, in a way, more formalization, because a bank is also making sure that the funds are paid and the contracts are in order, and all of that. So I think the banking sector has quite a role to play also in promoting that level of transparency, which hasn't existed. At the beginning, I talked about how many of these MSCs are in debt, were in debt before, have gone forward, and we've noticed that many are still not going to financial institutions. There's a complete lack of trust even with the financial institutions. They still would rather go to a pawnbroker or a money lender, even though the interest rates are astronomical, the repayment is awful. So there's many issues here that we need to break through. But I think for a start, this is where banks can, especially if they know and they feel comfortable also that they are partnering with some of the more established, larger entities that are more formal already. It makes things safer for also the banks to consider giving out these loans or this working capital to the suppliers that might not be in the formal channels. And then by creating the symbiotic relationship, also facilitate more formalization, which creates greater transparency.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Simran, for that answer. I think in the best interest of time, we have to conclude the Q&A session. Thank you very much for all participants who were very active in the Q&A session, as well as Ms. Simran for clearing out all the doubts we had. So before winding up, I'd like to now cordially invite the Deputy Governor of Central Bank, Mr. KMM Siriwardana, to deliver closing remarks. So what do you?
Thank you, Kishan. The Governor, Deshamana Professor Lakshman, our guest speaker, Ms. Simrin, the Deputy Governor, Ms. Fernando, the other panelists of this seminar, and all the participants. As you know, today's webinar on value chain financing for micro and small enterprises sector in Sri Lanka is a timely and an important topic in this very challenging situation. We know that MSC sector is a very important part of our overall economy, as highlighted by both the Governor and also Ms. Simrin. We also know that the MSC sector, which operates at the very grassroots level, has affected significantly due to the COVID-19 related developments. So in fact, at the initial stage of the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdowns brought many business operations to halt, which has subsequently started to change as the situation improves gradually. So given the situation, there's a need for having a pragmatic and effective approach to address operational and financial challenges that MSCs face to ensure their survival, facilitate the revival, and also promote the expansion. So in this context, Ms. Simrin gave us some valuable insight of value chain financing for micro and small enterprise sector based on the experiences and learning from the MPTF project. And it is something that we need to give a serious consideration. I think the ILO's direct value chain financing business model is something that we need to explore further for other industries as well to adopt in a broader way. Overall, it's imperative to understand the need for focusing on providing necessary assistance for smooth functioning of value chain related to micro and small sector in order to generate higher contribution from this sector to the broader economy. At the same time, it's important to have collaborative and coordinated efforts to facilitate these participants. With correct policy measures, exploitation of vendors in a value chain could be minimized, and it will create a better economic environment for all the participants. These policy measures will also facilitate the achievement of higher economic growth in the long term. So I believe it's our responsibility to make every possible effort and contribution to protect these value chain participants by taking necessary actions and encourage them to scale up their contribution to the economy. So in fact, the central bank is also planning to introduce a new project to support the agriculture value chain, which will be implemented through selected participatory financial institutions. We have selected 3 areas for the initial pilot project, that is vegetable, dairy, and spices, which is expected to launch in the near future. As you suggested, Ms. Simrin, issuing guidelines to commercial banks on indirect value chain financing is also an area that we will explore further. So finally, on behalf of the central bank, I would like to thank our guest speaker, Ms. Simrin, the country director for the ILO Country of Peace for Sri Lanka and the Maldives for delivering this fruitful lecture, and also to the governor, Deshamana Professor Lakshman, for chairing this webinar, Deputy Governor Ms. Fernando, the other panelists, and the Center for Banking Studies for organizing this event. So also I wish to express my sincere gratitude to all the participants at this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Governor, for those closing remarks. With that, we have come to the end of today's webinar. Thank you very much to all of you who tuned into us, and we will meet again very soon with another interesting topic. Until now, thanks once again. Have a good evening, and most importantly, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.